Okay, since this is the first lesson of the new course and first lesson of starting year 12, before we jump into the content, I'll just speak a little bit about starting year 12. Now, it was mentioned at the end of last term, but just reiterating, the main difference between how the course will be delivered to you in year 12 compared with last year is that every few weeks or so, when we reach the end of a little section or topic, we will be going over some past HSC questions on that topic, and that includes both multiple choice and longer answer type questions. Everything else will be much the same, simply just with the addition of those past questions. But by far the biggest difference that can be made is how you approach the course and the work that you do. So HSC exams are a whole year away. So how well do you remember what you were studying 1 year ago? So term 4 in year 10 was astronomy. How well do you remember that? So that's the light years, galaxies, nebula, how a star forms, what's happening. Does it all seem a little foggy? So for this module especially, I mean, all modules are important, but for this module, because it's going to seem like such a long time ago when it's exam time, you really need to make sure you've got good notes. So start with notes on everything. Don't assume that there's going to be stuff that you remember, because you might remember it now, but in a year's time, maybe not so much. So maybe start by having notes where you've written down every little thing, even if you're pretty sure you'll remember it. And then maybe from that, you can then maybe make a second set of notes to kind of be starting to summarize it. But you really need to make sure everything's locked down and don't rely on memory, because this stuff is going to be a year away when you're doing your exams. One thing that's in your favor for this module is that we have the Christmas holidays after this term. So if you do get a bit behind, don't. If you do get a bit behind, then you've got the Christmas holidays to catch up. But don't let that be a habit, because obviously you're not going to have these big long holiday periods after the terms next year. Little holidays, but not like a big Christmas holidays. Okay, so now's the time to get serious. So all those little things that you're probably logically aware of, or you realize, yes, these would be good things to do, and these would be good things that would help me. Like you know they'd be good to do, but you haven't been doing them. Now is the time to actually start that. So just a few examples of what these would be. So work hard in class, sit away from friends if you need to, make summary notes. As you're going along through the course, make a little kind of glossary or dictionary type thing. Every time you're coming up across a new word, and there's going to be many of them, write it down so you've got a separate little dictionary so you can improve your vocabulary. That's going to be a really important skill or really important knowledge to have in your long answer questions, so you can be using the right terms and the right words. Regular revision, always have to assume that your homework always includes regularly revising what you have done. Attend homework center, like one of those things you're probably realizing, oh, that'd be a good idea to do. Actually do it. Study with a super nerd friend. If you're a super nerd, study with another super nerd. If you're not a super nerd, see if you can get one to adopt you and study with them. Use Edrollo. Many of you weren't using Edrollo very much at all last year. So all these little things that you know will help, but you haven't been doing, now's the time to actually do it. Time to get serious. Just another quick reminder of just a good little scheme for regular revision. So this really helps with kind of memorizing stuff, with kind of retaining it in your memory. So if we start it when you first learn something in class, it's really important that in the first 48 hours, maybe better still if you can do it the night you do it, but at least in the first 48 hours after first doing something or learning about it in class, revise it again, then try to read it for a second time about a week later, a third time maybe about 2 weeks after you first learned it, and then again, about 4 weeks to a month after it. I know won't be able to stick to this schedule exactly, but it's really important to do it in that first 1 or 2 days, and again in about a week. Then see if you can just try to get a couple more in the next few weeks after that. So if you can get to the point where about a month after you've learnt everything, you've already read it and revised it 4 times, imagine how much that's going to help. But this kind of schedule really helps with kind of retaining stuff in your memory. Okay, so this is taken from the KISS notes. it just kind of shows a little rough outline of what this module is going to look like. Now, we may not be breaking it up into these kind of 5 groups exactly, but it's a good way of kind of breaking up all the little things that are in this module. So it's called heredity, which is basically, I guess, passing on genetic information to offspring, and continuity of the species. So we've got the 5 main areas. So reproduction, looking at sexual versus asexual reproduction, fertilization. Next, we'll look at cell replication, starting to get into some genes, chromosomes, and DNA. Looking at the actual mechanisms of cell division and actual DNA structure and replication. Then we're looking at protein synthesis or polypeptide synthesis. So actually looking in detail at how the DNA is actually turned into protein and what's happening there. Population genetics. So starting to look at the Human Genome Project, starting to look at, I guess, starting to zoom out a little bit and look at kind of DNA as a whole, perhaps in, at a whole genome or perhaps in populations, but furthermore to, and then genetic variation. So a bit of this kind of classical genetics. You'll understand that more when we do it. So that's kind of like, I guess, the 5 little areas within this module that we'll be doing. We'll be starting with reproduction. So specifically, we'll be starting with sexual reproduction. So just quickly, these are the outcomes covered. You can pause to check those off. So the importance of reproduction first. So reproduction just means making a copy or a likeness of something. So reproduction is a fundamental evolutionary process as it ensures the continuity of life. That phrase, that wording is very important. So individuals have a finite lifespan, like everything dies. So in order for a population of a species to survive, they must be able to reproduce. Now, there are 2 main types of reproduction, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Pardon me. Now, I guess the very simple definitions we can have of those 2 for now is sexual reproduction involves 2 different parents. Asexual reproduction comes from just 1 parent. So what is sexual reproduction? So as I just said, it involves 2 parents who produce an offspring. And the idea is that the offspring has a mix of genes from the 2 different parents. So each of you is a mix of your parents. Now, I guess one little thing we'll see, sexual reproduction doesn't refer specifically to the act of having sex. It doesn't always involve having sex. Sexual reproduction happens in plants. Other animals will, where it works out differently. So it mostly refers to 2 different parents. So the advantage of sexual reproduction. Look, the simplest way to explain it, and we'll elaborate, is just it increases the genetic variation. So you are a mix of your mum and dad. Your mum and dad is a mix of their mum and dad. So like everyone is a mix of a mix of a mix, which helps make everyone be a little bit different. So big advantage is it increases genetic variation. So offspring are not identical to either parent, but also interestingly, and we will work on this later when we talk about meiosis, but also offspring are not identical to each other. So even though if you have brothers and sisters, you're all a mix of your mum and dad, but you're not the same mix. You are all a bit different as well. So we've got different to parents, but also siblings different to each other. All very important for increasing variation. And why is variation important? We should remember from evolution that variation in the species is essential if there is going to be some kind of selection pressure, and you hope there's going to be a variation that will survive a selection pressure. It will adapt, survive. So this allows the population of the species to continue to grow stronger, to continue to survive if there is variation. If everyone's the same and there's some kind of selection pressure that's difficult, it just might knock them all out in one hit. Variation means there's a chance there's going to be one type of variant that will survive. Disadvantages of sexual reproduction, greater energy demands. So undergoing sexual reproduction can use up a lot of energy as organisms must find a mate, perform courtship behavior, produce gametes and a mate. So girls, whatever he says, often these attempts to find a mate and produce a mate often go unrewarded. There's a lot of time and effort wasted, whatever he says. So the expenditure of more energy in sexual reproduction, it could make an individual more vulnerable to predation. It could make it harder for the organism to survive if they're wandering around, chasing a mate. They're not looking for food. They're making themselves more vulnerable to predators. This could obviously decrease the likelihood of continuity of the species and could be loss of individuals. When we talk about plants, we could also add to the greater energy demands the point that a lot of plants, or the reason that they'll kind of produce things like brightly colored flowers and sweet nectar to attract pollinators, that all requires a lot of energy as well. And that's all aimed at facilitating sexual reproduction. So I've talked about advantages and disadvantages. Now we're just going to look at fertilization and define a few more terms. So firstly, gametes. Gametes are the sex cells. If we think of people, it's the eggs and the sperm. So it's the sex cells created by individuals in the sex organs. Now the biological process that creates gametes is meiosis. We will be talking about meiosis as part of this module, but that comes a bit later. So gametes are haploid. So that means they have half the number of chromosomes as the parent cell. Now we could add to that, like in each of us, let's say just about all of our cells, all of our cells, we have DNA from both our mum and our dad. So for all genes, for all chromosomes, there's one copy that comes from our mum, one copy that comes from our dad. That happens in all cells except for the gametes. The gametes, there are not two copies of everything. There's only one copy of everything. Again, it'll all make more sense when you do meiosis. Now, fertilization, which is the union of the gametes. So when fertilization occurs, in us, we've got sperm combines with an egg to produce a fertilized egg. So the fertilized egg, after the two gametes have come together, that is called a zygote. And now that is diploid. Because the idea is if we've got two separate gametes, they have only one copy of DNA each, which is half the normal. Once we have one and one come together to make a zygote, we've now got 1 + 1 is 2. We're back to having two copies of the DNA. So new terms, put this in your dictionary. We've got gametes are the sex cells. Fertilization involves union of the gametes. They need to fuse together to form a zygote. Now, there's two types of fertilization, simply external fertilization and internal, and that just refers to, I guess, the body. So external fertilization means that the union of the gametes occurs outside of the body. Internal fertilization means the union of the gametes occurs inside the body. Now, successful fertilization relies on, so the sperm and the egg obviously needs to meet and come together. But the other big thing is that the gametes don't dehydrate. That'll make more sense as we move further on. So examples of organisms that use external fertilization usually include something involved in water. So we've got amphibians, so for example, cane toads, coral, bony fish. So all of these organisms will be doing their fertilization in water. They don't need to worry about it drying out. So it makes sense for them to be able to do it externally. And it works a bit differently for all of them. So the fish, for example, we've got the male and female fish kind of come together. The female fish quickly lays her eggs, and then the male fish jumps kind of straight in after her, and then will spreads his sperm over the eggs that she's just kind of spread out into the water. Coral is pretty interesting. Coral is just over. It can only happen one night, maybe 2 nights, but they all sync up, and there's just kind of 1 or 2 nights where they all just release their stuff into the water. Usually has to be done in high numbers. They'll just kind of release everything into the water at the same time, hoping something's going to meet up. So a little bit more on kind of what I spoke about there. So external fertilization. So it's suited to organisms that reproduce in an aquatic environment in water. So the water allows the gametes to meet. The water also prevents the gametes from desiccating or drying out. Gametes are released into the surrounding environment. It's not internal, they just release it into their external environment. We need a big number, so an enormous number of gametes is produced by both males and females to increase the chance of two gametes actually meeting. The gametes need to be released simultaneously, so at the same time or as close to the same time as possible to give them a chance to meet up. And many offspring must be produced, as there's usually no parental care, and many perish. So due to the environment and predators. So it's like when the gametes fuse, the babies are on their own. They don't have their parents with them helping them out. So start with big numbers. The idea is that eventually there's going to be some left to grow to adulthood for continuity of the species. So internal fertilization, it's more like what happens with us, obviously. So examples of organisms that use internal fertilization includes reptiles, birds, and mammals. Now, internal fertilization is suited to organisms that reproduce on land or in terrestrial environments. Terrestrial just means on land. So gametes would not be able to travel through the air. They can't swim or move. They would dry out. So what happens is the male inserts his gametes, in this case sperm, into a female's body during copulation, which is another word for mating. So the male releases his inside. The female obviously also has to release her gametes inside as well. So the gametes are released inside the female body. We don't need as many gametes released. So there's usually still a lot more sperm in our example with humans. That's usually a one egg. So we don't need as many gametes. The chance of fertilization is higher because they're confined in a fairly small space. The chances of the two gametes actually meeting each other is quite high if we can keep it all in a small space. Usually there's also some degree of parental care, which means that there's a greater chance of offspring surviving, and it means that you can also get away with not having to produce as many offspring. You don't have to produce heaps and heaps and heaps just so some will survive. If you look after them, you can just only produce a few, just look after them, then you may end up with the same number surviving as some of the external fertilization examples we saw earlier. So that concludes what we have for this lesson. Next lesson, we'll be looking at sexual reproduction in plants, which is pretty much all focused on flowers. We're going to be needing to know all of these names. If you want to start looking at it now, feel free. So yeah, that's next lesson. Thank you.